All right, today is April 25, 2019. This is the meeting of the Kubernetes Storage Special Interest Group. Today on the agenda, we have a lot of items, so we'll try to move through them quickly. First up, we're going to go through the Q2 2019 planning for the 115 release of Kubernetes. Important dates to keep in mind. Next Tuesday, April 30th, is the enhancement freeze. By this date, if you have a feature that you're working on that is a feature and not a bug, you need to make sure that you have an enhancement issue open for it before that date. And you also need to make sure that the KEP for that enhancement has been merged and marked as implementable. So please keep that in mind. We have a couple of columns in this spreadsheet that we're using to keep track of this. The enhancement issue is here. If you're red, you need to open an enhancement issue, otherwise your feature is going to get blocked. And then the second thing is, if you have an enhancement issue, also make sure you have a KEP. If you don't, then the feature will get blocked. So let's go ahead and get started getting status updates. I'm going to create a new column over here for April 25. So first up is the migration of in-tree volume plugins to CSI. Either David, Chang, or Deep, do anyone, if you have an update on this?
Yeah, I can go ahead. So we are making some good progress. The current things in progress are pretty much locking down on the entry volume design. So we have some additional API reviews that might need to happen because we realized certain fields from PVs are missing for inline volumes. There's been a lot of discussions between Hemant and Cheng around how to get migration working for resizing. The plan there is to potentially use some kind of annotations to basically signal from the entry side to the external resizer that this needs to be migrated. There's also work happening around the attached limits. So a KEP is in progress there, and the design is still happening. And finally, there's the test infra work that David is doing that keeps track of metrics to make sure that the flow is going through the migrated code and not through the entry code when operations are executed with the flags enabled for migration.
Cool. Sounds like a lot of work. Thank you very much for that update.
Sure.
Next item is CI and test. Imagine that hasn't started yet.
Yeah, that's what I was just mentioning. I think I covered it in the last one.
Okay.
So David is working on that.
Got it.
And it's using the metrics from entry and comparing the metrics, and yeah, it's a work in progress.
Okay. And then the next item we have is CSI online offline resizing support volume expansion. A month.
Yeah, it's a ongoing work. We have work going on for EBS resizing, and I have scoped out the work that needs to happen for CSI resizing itself. But I'm also working on the migration piece so that it works nicely for when the migration is enabled for a volume plugin.
Okay. And then is there do we need a KEP for this?
The same KEP will work for the last quarter that we had open.
Okay.
We have a KEP. I'll just link it here.
Got it. And this enhancement issue is resizing support to CSI volumes. Okay. So does that KEP need to be updated or anything for the beta?
Not major update, but I already have a PR out to update, address some of your comments. If you can take a look.
Cool. Yeah, feel free to ping me on Slack and then I can take a look.
Okay.
All right. Next item is CSI entry block volume support, which is going to remain in beta, but we want to add more tests for it. Masaki, any updates on that, or Ben?
far as I know, it's not started. I don't know if Masaki's here.
Yeah, I spoke with Masaki over Slack. He said he would be able to work on this. I think we just need to have have some more discussion in the bug about exactly what test cases we want to add.
And I can provide some suggestions.
Okay, that'll be great.
Okay, cool. Thank you both. It seems like this doesn't really need any new CUP, right?
For new tests, I can't imagine why they would need a CUP.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Next item is CSI pod inline volume support. Vlad, any updates on that? Maybe Vlad's not on the line. Can someone else give an update on his behalf?
Yeah, I can give an update. Yeah, Vlad's been making a lot of good progress on this. I think, I believe now most of the issues should have been fixed. So you can, he's been able to test out, I think, both drivers, the host path driver, and also Kevin had an image populator driver, and I think both of them were able to work. So the next steps that he has is to work on the E2E testing and also address some of the minor review comments.
Okay, and none of that has been merged yet?
You mean the E2E testing?
I think there were some refactors that were going in.
Yeah, those are still in progress.
Okay, cool. Scalability tests. We are still looking for an owner here. Again, if anyone's interested in getting their hands on a 5,000 node cluster, please reach out to Michelle or Ben, and we can tell you what needs to be done here. If not, we'll drop this from this quarter. And since we don't have anybody assigned, Michelle, maybe let's drop the priority of this to 2.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. Okay, next item is audit CSI PVPVC code for issue related to some number. So last update here was we had a committed owner. Any updates in terms of implementation for this?
Sorry, which item was this?
This is the audit CSI code for related issues. I guess it's not an audit anymore. It's address.
Yeah. I will speak to Ye Ching about this. Yeah.
Okay. Next item is the CSI library, moving the Mount library to external common code. I think Travis had questions last time about the mounter, exec mounter code, and if that needed to be migrated or not, and then he split that out. Travis, any updates on any of that?
Saad, I think a lot of the VMware storage guys are at an offsite this week, so I think they're not here at the meeting.
Okay. All right, cool.
Oh, but I've been following along. Travis has been making progress on this, steady progress.
Cool. That sounds good to me. Thank you. Next item is CSI entry per node volume attachment limits, which is going to remain in beta but be redesigned. Jan or Haman, any updates on this?
Jan is on PTO this week, but I've been making addressing all the comments that are there on the KEP. I think I have addressed right now all the comments. So we had a call last week with Bobby. He was mostly happy with it. He wants to defer to 6 storage for general approval first, and then he will LGTM it. So that's the.
Okay. That sounds good. So kept is in progress. Looks like everything's on track here. Cool. Thank you. Next item is volume capacity and usage metrics. Volume capacity and usage metrics was in progress last time. There was a PR opened for this. Any updates on that, Hemant?
Yeah, so PR is open. I think it's mostly complete, but I have asked Humble to add some more tests to it and at least one end-to-end test. And it should work. Just a matrix thing, like we need to implement a new interface, so we are not doing a KEP for this.
Okay. So we're gonna say no KEP for this. Is this because it's why no KEP?
It's pretty small. It's pretty small, and it's like doesn't affect any behavior change or anything. It just
Okay. So
we
we're
have
calling
added.
it bug level. Are you?
Yeah.
Is there any feature flag or anything on it?
No, there's no feature flag on it.
Okay. We'll call it a bug fix then.
That makes sense to me, unless
Okay. Is there going to be documentation we need to add for it somewhere, or we're just going to correct that separately?
We should document it though in the CSI docs at least,
Okay.
so that people know that if their driver emits the matrix, this stats, then it will be automatically become available in from Kubelet.
Okay, so we'll add documentation here and make sure we get it added on the CSI side.
Okay.
Next item is CSI per PVC volume provisioning secrets. We were looking for an owner here. Luis was pointed out as somebody who might be interested in this. Michelle, were you able to find an owner for this?
I haven't.
Okay.
I haven't pinged Luis on it.
Got
Is Luis here? No.
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, let me ping him right now, and I'll see.
Okay. And if anybody else on this call is interested, this is relatively small, but pretty powerful functionality. It's around templating the provisioning secret for the CSI external provisioner. If that's something that functionality you're interested in, please feel free to volunteer. Okay. Next item is snapshot delete volume finalizer when the snapshot is being created. Any updates on that, Xing?
Yeah, so Yang reviewed it. I addressed the comments, but now there's some ETU test failure, so I need to look into that.
Okay. Okay. And does this need a KEP?
I don't think so. We implemented a couple of other finalizer. We didn't really add a cap for that.
Seems reasonable. Snapshot execution hook.
Yeah, so the cap is updated, and Inan from SIGApps has been reviewing it. So this one needs to emerge by next Tuesday, right? So I think there's a risk we might need to get an exception if it's not merged by then. Can you review this? I think right now we have you and Inan.
Okay. Yes, I can. And if you ping me on Slack, that'll remind me to take a look at it.
Okay, sure.
I actually had a couple of meetings with, Jing yesterday about this now that I remember.
Oh, okay.
So if you can sync up with Jing, I think there's some feedback that I have.
Oh, okay, sure. We'll address that. Yeah, I will talk to her. Okay. And yeah, also Tim has a note there saying ping him when this is ready. So I think he looked at it very early version of this.
Yeah, we also had him take a look yesterday. He also had.
Oh,
feedback,
okay,
so,
great. Okay.
I think Jing has the latest on all of that.
Oh, okay, cool. That's great.
Cool, thank you. Next item is, oh, actually, can you make sure to have a enhancement issue?
I should add it. We do have, I opened one. Okay, I will add that here.
Cool,
Okay.
thank you. Next item is snapshot quota.
So I can put together a small doc for this one.
Okay.
I'm not sure if this one, does this one need a cap at all, or is it just implemented, or I'm not sure. It's kind of small. I don't know what's usually done
Is there
for
any
this
code
type of.
internally that's being touched, Kubernetes code?
I do not believe that's needed, but maybe I will put together a small doc on using Google Docs, and then we'll decide then.
Okay. So we'll call it, we'll say for now you do need it. Okay, next item is, excuse me, automating the sidecar release and test process, end-to-end testing. Patrick was working on this. Last status update was that it was in progress. Any new updates here, Michelle?
Let's see, what was this? Oh, so actually, this is this has been done as of 114. I think right now the only thing that's remaining is to write up some documentation and then publish it out to the SIG.
Okay.
I think Methusen is working on writing up some documentation and along with an example using the NFS driver.
Cool. Yep, that sounds like solid progress. Okay, next item is refactoring kubelet device plugin.
Oh, sorry, I think I was talking about the wrong thing.
Oh, okay.
This one is done. This is automating the E2E, the CI on our sidecar repos.
Mm-hmm.
The one I was referring to was having the out of tree E2E test suite.
Ah, okay. Out of tree E2E test suite. Yep, I don't think we're tracking that for this quarter.
Oh, here we go. It's item 32.
32, okay.
Okay, sorry. I jumped ahead.
I'll just move this down. Down to 32. Oops. This one. Okay, and then for
the sidecar CI, it's done.
Okay.
And there's no more work needed.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much for that. That's one of the first items done. Next item is refactoring the kubelet device plugin to reconciliation model. This PR is still in progress. I took another look at it last night. It looked pretty close to done. It needed a rebase, and there were a couple of nits and one open question I had. Other than that, it looks mostly done, so this is in good condition. Next item is enabling PVC as data source, volume cloning. John, any updates on this? Okay, we'll follow up with this offline. And I'm not sure why this is red, but we definitely need. Oh, well, I'll fix that later. Next is volume snapshot namespace transfer. It looks like John's not here either, so no update on that. Scalability testing, we already discussed. We're still looking for an owner. Next up is consistency groups. Xing, any progress on this?
Not yet. I think once the execution hook cap is merged, we can start into this one.
Yep, makes sense. And this is going to be a design for this quarter. Next item is populator data source. John is not here, so we're going to mark that as no update. And next up is the CSI drivers for NFS, iSCSI, and Fiber Channel. Anyone have updates on this? Mathusin, Pratik, Matt Wong?
Yeah, for the NFS driver, we have a PRL that adds end-to-end tests using the framework from Line32.
Okay. Adding end-to-end tests. Cool. I think for the iSCSI one, John was working on it, and then Fiber Channel, we had no update. Okay. Non-recursive volume ownership design. Hemant, any updates on this?
Yeah, so no design finalized yet, but I've been having talking with Michelle. Jing had some ideas, so we are working on a document, and we'll have a design hopefully at the end of 1.115 quarters.
Okay, sounds good. Next item is file permission handling for Windows. We were looking for an owner for this. Deep would be willing to help review that. Is anybody interested? I think there was some talk about, I think somebody from Windows might be able to help with this, or I can't remember.
Yeah, so it was basically on me to get someone from my team to potentially start engaging with Hemant, but that has not happened yet.
Okay.
So, no updates.
Still looking for an owner. Next item is revisiting the UID GID handling with volumes. Brad, looks like our last update here was the work was approved internally, I think, at Red Hat.
Yep. So we have internal buy-off, and I believe we've started some of this too, right, Hemant?
Yeah, we are trying to at least the design that we have, the discussions I'm having with Michelle and Jing, we are trying to see if we can incorporate some of the UID based permissions into the existing design so that it's more uniform and handles that as well. It's tricky though, because obviously it means like if two containers are using same UID and they want to use the same volume, then we have problems. But working on to the design how to solve it.
Okay, cool. Sounds like solid progress. Next item is volume expansion for stateful sets. This was blocked on resizing for offline. I think, well, let me see if I can follow up with this offline to sort this out.
Yeah, so Siddharth has, and I started a Google Doc offline to share some of the ideas. And he proposed some ideas, I proposed some ideas, but I haven't had a look into last week actually, just been busy with other stuff. So, but since it's a design only item for 115, I will look into it like next week by Monday, hopefully, and see which idea we can, which of the ideas we can use to solve the offline resizing part for stateful.
Okay. That makes sense. So then I'll consider this started since the doc has been started. Thank you.
Yeah.
Volume health. Nick Wren was potentially volunteered as someone who's interested in working on this. Xing, any updates on this?
Yeah, so I talked to Jing about using volume taints for volume health. So she gave some suggestions. Nick incorporated that in the doc, and Michelle has been reviewing it. Also, I need to update the CSI part of the design.
Okay. Next item is in-tree topology post-GA work. The work here is to switch the default storage class and backfill older PVs with node affinity. Any update on this? This is a lower priority item, so I don't expect any.
Oh, this is still on my plate to sync up with Michelle on this.
Yep, makes sense. This is a P3, so. Next item is passing ownership created by metadata from stateful sets to PVCs. We needed a design here. Haley, any updates on this?
I synced up with Haley a couple weeks ago. She started a brainstorming document.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Next item is pluggable end-to-end test framework, which we already got an update on. Thank you, Michelle. Next item is CSI entry read-only handling. This is an important item that we do not have an owner for. I know some people have been mailing on, I think, the SIG storage mailing list, asking about things that are related to this. So if you think the read-only code is weird or doesn't make sense and you want to help fix it, there are a couple of bug fixes that are outlined in this issue. And if you're interested in helping implement them, please reach out to us. Next item is alpha beta GA designation of CSI spec. There was a proof of concept that was put together, but I haven't followed up on that to review it yet. So. Next item is support containerized CSI node plugins in Windows using the storage proxy executable. There was a lot of exciting news about this last time.
Yeah, so I've been continuing work on this. I got a bit stuck with, so I've been using GCPD mainly to try out the various changes. So in that regards, what I was stuck with was mainly getting to the metadata server from the Windows containers. So spoke a bit with Peter Horniak, who helps out with various things, GCP and SIG Windows, and he was able to show me some pointers. So with that, I'm unblocked and yeah, just making progress. I don't think this will be in a kept form in 1.15. So like, you know, I'll prototype a little more to kind of have a solid kept most likely for 1.16, if that's okay.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. So it is marked as designed for this quarter, so that makes sense. We can just get them kept merged by end of quarter. That'd be perfectly fine.
Awesome.
All right, thank you. That's great progress. Next item is metric support for CSI, potentially custom metrics for CSI drivers. Humble or Hemant, any updates on this? Okay, I'm just going to mark that as no update. Moving on from the planning session, we have a design review today. I'm going to hand it over to Erin and her team to walk through object bucket dynamic provisioning. So for context, this SIG has mostly been focused on block and file. You know, Erin and her team are pointing out, well, the benefits that we have by using PVC to be able to dynamically provision volumes, and the benefits of the portability for workloads that provides is pretty valuable, and to be able to apply those patterns to object storage would be very interesting as well. And she wanted to kick off the discussions about that. And so she wanted to present that design here. Erin?
Thanks, Thad. So as Sad mentioned, in the past, we have really been purely focused on file and block, and looking at application portability being our primary motivator of using the Kubernetes Federation v2 APIs. Having a construct similar to the PV/PVC annotations, or resources rather, would be useful. We talked to the SIG probably 6 months ago, various people and vendors, about how they handled object. Many of us took the route of using the service catalog to expose that, but from a usability standpoint alone and an administrative standpoint, it becomes kind of a secondary set of storage that we're administering and trying to keep track of outside of storage. And then when it's tied to a workload, it becomes even more complicated figuring out how to move that. So what we're suggesting in this design is some new CRDs that are called Object Bucket and Object Bucket Claims. The names are intentionally familiar to be used as an admin with the same look and feel. The difference being that with Object, you have to, probably one of the primary differences, you have to create a user within that data store and the data store itself. So, just the differences between binding and user creation, we created the CRDs to be separate instead of trying to shove them into the PV/PVC framework.
Hi, Erin, are you sharing anything?
No, I'm not. I'm going to let John and Jeff. So I'm just giving
okay.
an overview of why we did that. And we've created a S3 provisioner as just a sample to show that it works. And I'll hand it over to John now, and he can walk through how we went about doing that through the use of the library. And then Scott, I believe, is going to demo the S3 provisioner.
John is.
John is. Okay. So go ahead, John, if you want to talk about the design, or Jeff.
Hey, John, go ahead, just because I know some people on the call have heard about us using controller runtime, and we've switched to doing our own controller. But John, you could do just a high overview of the Kubernetes aspects of the design, and then we've got a fast, quick demo. I know there's other things in the agenda beyond this.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we're trying to enable object store vendors. We're trying to give them the ability to write their own provisioners, much like the SIG storage lib external provisioner library does. So the key component here is that they should only have to call a very simple API and define just a handful of interfaces that will be used by this library to provision, deprovision buckets, or grant access to what we call brownfield buckets, pre-existing buckets that weren't generated dynamically. So it internalizes its own controller. The idea is that you should only have to call you should only have to define a provision and delete method at a minimum. Then you call new provisioner. You would pass your provisioner with these methods defined to that function, and then you call run. And then it should go from there. We've written a simple AWS S3 provisioner as a way to exemplify this. So let me go ahead and run the demo here, unless Jeff, if you'd like to add anything.
I would, just to anticipate, because there's been some comments made in our design about that it seems like our focus is the control plane and not the data plane. And that's a true statement. And the data plane is difficult to solve because there's not, there's Amazon S3 as the de facto standard for buckets and objects within the buckets, but there isn't a POSIX equivalent of that or any IEEE sanctioned standard. So we are focused on the control plane, using familiar resources for a Kubernetes administrator, separation of concerns between developers and admin, utilizing storage classes and so forth. So these things are familiar, and John will show you those in the demo. And the links in the agenda show our links to the library, to our design document, and the links to the simple S3 provisioner. So if there's interest in that, you can click those links and get more information.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So like you mentioned, we're using storage classes here. We decided not to write our own CRD to aid in the familiarity of the design. Some things we've written specifically for the AWS provisioner, we have parameter list here that will specify a secret name and namespace. This is the admin secret, and the provisioner will when a request comes in, it's when an OBC is created, rather, it specifies a storage class. The AWS provisioner will use the secret provided or defined by that storage class to create the bucket. It will also create a key with very limited permissions, only within the bucket that is provided back to the user. So in this way, we're able to define, say, separate credentials for separate provisioners or separate roles within the same user. And just to give you a look at what an OBC looks like, they're relatively simplistic. We've added the ability, you see here, generate bucket name. This is the name of the actual bucket in AWS. You can also define your own name, but we thought it would be prudent to avoid name collisions, or give people the ability to avoid name collisions with this. And then, of course, you define your storage class here as well. So in the lower section, I have the running log output of the provisioner. It's running on my host machine right now, not in a pod. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing any existing pods, OBCs, OB secrets, and config maps that exist on the right-hand side. So what happens is when a user wants to request a bucket, it's a simple kube control create OBC. Provisioner will detect the OBC is kicked off. The library will know the name of the provisioner and will do a check beforehand. And pretty quickly here you see, so we've already got a successfully reconciled log line. The provisioner has detected the OBC, validated that it's of the provisioner that it is being used for, and made the call, or called provision, which was the provisioner defined method, and given us back a config map and a secret in our namespace. And those look like, let's see here. The secret contains the dynamically generated key that will be used to connect to just this bucket. Oops. Oh, right. There we go. And so you have these one-off AWS credentials here. These will be mounted into a pod. And then we've got the config map that contains all the connection data that is commonly expected for connecting to pods. And so we have a bucket host here, we have a bucket name, the port, the region, and if I were to do an AWS S3, you'll see that I'm not faking it. This bucket was created. And then conversely, when you want to delete, it's the same process you would with a PVC. So kubectl delete OBC. The provisioner detects the delete, validates that it's it matches its provisioner, deletes the bucket, deletes the user and the key. So all the AWS resources that were generated are cleaned up after the fact, and the key can't be reused. And that essentially concludes the demo right now. Happy to take questions.
I think it's important to point out, just for people on the call here, that this is not an operator. It doesn't run. This bucket provision isn't an operator. It's a library. It's imported by each provisioner. The provisioners have the knowledge of what it takes to create buckets in their object store. The library does not. The library is a control plane that knows about secrets, config maps, CRDs, etc., and orchestrates calls to provisioners that have this, like I said, object store specific knowledge. So it's very similar in concept to external storage provisioning in Kubernetes, and even the separation is similar to CSI, where there's, the details of the CSI driver are not important to Kubernetes. And so we're following along that philosophy, but applying to buckets.
So are there questions? It's pretty quiet, so.
I had a question. So after provisioning, it outputs a config map with the details of that bucket. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how do pods end up using that?
They consume the config map as they would, and secret. So they get the endpoint information from the config map. Many of the existing applications that are, that are consuming S3 buckets already have environment variables for that information, which would override a config file. The idea is that you do not need to have in our case for this S3 provisioner, you wouldn't need an S3 library on every target node that your provisioner might land on. It's self-contained within the config map and the secret that's generated. So Michelle, the pod just consumes the CM and secret like it would any other one. You don't have to agree on the key field names, because you can, in the pod spec, as you know, you can map them to any number, any name you want that the pod expects the name to be for a bucket name or URL, things like that.
Okay, I guess are these, so the config map defined a bunch of environment variables. Are these environment variables standard across all object store implementations?
No, they are defined statically by the library. So they'll be the same for any provisioner that implements the library, but the answer is no.
So then the provisioner needs to understand which object storage library the pod needs to use?
Correct. It's one thing we're not trying to solve with this, and I think we need to say it explicitly, is similar to the same problem that Service Catalog was not trying to solve. It's too difficult right now to differentiate between object vendors. And so what we're trying to do is standardize the way in which they're provisioned, but not abstract the actual vendor from the user, because ultimately they will have to know who they're talking to.
Okay,
and what comes with that is certain.
So I guess if I'm not totally familiar with like the object storage API landscape, but are there like multiple object storage SDKs that can work against S3?
I would say S3 is the de facto standard, and even if a vendor does implement their own custom SDK, they usually provide support for the standard S3 API. So we've exposed the common pieces of what S3 exposes that most all vendors would also expose.
Okay, so these environment variables that were defined, they actually can work across multiple object storage implementations as long as they implement the S3 API?
That's the idea.
Well,
I think most of the time it should work, but there are some limitations.
Definitely. And so that's why, just like we have a provisioner for file and block, there might be specific things to that type of storage that need to be part of that provisioner that facilitate, some specialty of that storage type.
Yeah. One thing, because I worked on something pretty similar with Spring Cloud a while back, and had to support both the AWS and also a JCloud's client. And so it might be good to add an S3 URL environment variable to this also, which I noticed that JClouds and Spring can consume. But I did something real similar with Service Broker type stuff when creating these environment variables for credentials.
Yeah, and Michelle, it seemed like maybe part of your focus was like on existing S3 applications. Do they use the same environment variable names that you see in the config map? And the answer is some might, but others wouldn't. There's not any guarantee of that. However, if you have an application that now works with a config map, and then underneath the covers, your storage administrator decides we're going to not use S3, we're going to use something else as our object store. And the storage class is changed to reflect that. your same app can run now with a different object store without being changed.
Okay, yeah, that was kind of what I was asking. Like, if you change out are these environment variables that it's outputting like standardized so that if you change out the provisioner underneath on like a different environment, will the application still be able to run with the same environment variables?
Yes, except there's possibilities that if the app did some, S3 extension, sort of a less used feature of the S3 API, and then the new object store doesn't implement that, well, then the answer is no, right? I mean, that's the issue with the data plane not being guaranteed. But in cases where portability matters in your app design and you use, sort of a lowest common denominator of API features, then your app should be able to move across different object stores without needing to change the deployment of your app and the names of those variables, because the library will use those same names for any object store.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Thanks.
So are you also planning to support provisioning of objects? Or you only want to do this for the bucket but not for the object itself?
Our focus right now is strictly for buckets. That doesn't mean we aren't considering object maybe in the future, but right now we're trying to really get buckets nailed down.
Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions. Aaron can be a focal point, but also any the repos, public repos, and you can start a dialogue there as well for this stuff.
I have one quick question. Is there any effort to, maybe at the CNCF to standardize, quote unquote S3?
Not right now. No.
I really dislike that we use a proprietary vendor's name, as like a standard. Right?
But S3 is actually the de facto. Basically, almost every object, or maybe most, will have this S3 compatible, right? So I think
the CNCF doesn't. Let me clarify this. The CNCF doesn't pick winners and make standards. The idea of the CNCF is to foster many projects to provide a rich landscape of choices that have a certain, held up to a certain standard of cloud nativeness. So even if the CNCF did accept various object projects into it, it wouldn't be saying one is the standard over the other. So I just want to make sure that's abundantly clear.
All right, but
let me inject real quick too. So the library itself is actually not opinionated about the object interface. We don't have any code in there that uses any part of the AWS S3 SDK. So that's entirely on the provisioner side. If you wanted to write a different provisioner, say EdgeFS with a different API, the library would support that too. Correct. We have, so like the one caveat to that is environment variable names are skewed towards S3. You don't see it here because it's omitted if it's empty, but the object bucket that gets, not to get too into the weeds here, but essentially that we've allowed for custom variable names and variables to be written to both the secret and the config map if those are if those vary between interfaces. So we don't actually use S3 at all in the library.
Right. And I'm not really suggesting that we say we come up with a different standard or say S3 is the standard. I'm just wondering if it's time to go and create a spec that says here's what we're going to call a standard, even if it does look pretty close to S3 or something that's already out there.
Yeah, and I don't think the CNCF is the right place for that because they don't want to set standards and they don't want to be kingmakers. I mean, that would be more of...
It would be closer to the CSI spec, right? It's an API. It's not an...
Right, Brad, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I really like the direction that this is going. I think we want to get to a point where we can abstract away object storage just like we have done with block and file. That portability of let me write my application once and be able to run it anywhere, it has been extremely valuable. So if we can replicate that for object stores, that would be awesome. Right now with what's proposed, I think there's two aspects of it. One is dynamic provisioning of an arbitrary resource with an arbitrary bucket within a cluster. And then the second part is making your workload portable across different environments. So the first part of that, dynamic provisioning, this nails pretty well. It follows the same model that we have for block and file, and it can do that. Now, my concern is that we already have a mechanism that focuses purely on dynamic provisioning without portability, and that's Open Service Broker. And Open Service Broker allows you to, for any given environment, be able to provision arbitrary resources. Somebody on the call actually mentioned the Open Service Broker implementation for different object stores. And I want this project to differentiate from that, to go above and beyond that and say, hey, Open Service Broker is able to provision a bucket and create a config map, and then a pod can consume that in whatever the way that they want. If we can go beyond that to kind of have a better last mile story, I think the last few questions have been alluding to this. I know it's a difficult challenge to solve, but I think we should try and figure out how to make that last mile more portable. I know there are folks on my team who are interested in helping with that as well. So if you want to do some follow-up meetings and start discussions on that, we'd be happy to talk about that as well.
Right. And from a Red Hat perspective, my team is actually intimately involved in directly that and how we do this. Like we have, examples where we can dynamically provision, object with the storage class, move it to a different cluster, leverage the same means of what we want to do. And we're doing it all on, the Kubernetes Federation V2 APIs. So, I think that is our motivating factor. Our motivating factor is usability, consistency, and application portability. We're hoping that this approach allows us to contain all of that. So
yeah, I think this is the right first steps, and we just need to carry forth the conversation and sort out the story for that last mile and standardize it. And so ideally what I want is, as an application developer, I don't really have to think if I'm going to run in on-prem or AWS or Google Cloud or some weird funky paths, that what object store am I going to be using? Do I have to rewrite my application with a specific client? Like, forget that. I want to be able to write it once and have it work anywhere. If we can get to that point, this will be a huge hit.
And that's way having the CRDs defined and leveraging storage classes like we normally would.
But it also is like, to get what Saad's saying, it's really, it's defining the data path too. And that requires probably some API mapper or some other technology that knows about all the object APIs out there. But Saad, who could we talk to get to advance the? It sounds like what you're saying. The control path is reasonably good in this design, but the data path isn't there. And
if you want to set up kind of like one-off design meetings, I can invite the right folks from my team and other folks, and you can send it out to SIG Storage as well to see if there's others interested, and we can just carry the discussions on.
And we have other people within Red Hat besides us that are
done. Yeah. This is Aaron Spiegel with Dell, and we'd definitely be interested in this conversation. We've been real active with Open Service Broker and our S3 storage. So this is something that, like, getting the benefits and trade-offs between this and Service Broker is something we'd like to get real crystallized and nailed down. But I think part of the challenge that you mentioned is we'd never have standardized on what the connectivity credentials for the S3 client are. Like, everyone puts them into different environment variables. And so having like a standard secret block that any provider can produce. And I think honestly, like everyone will have to code to it because nothing is really in place. But there are a couple of implementations, like I mentioned, JClouds and Spring Cloud that are out there. And there's also one in Python that's been working with service broker type stuff. So if we can, manage to one of those or an average of those or something, then I think it'll work relatively well.
Okay, I'll send the invite then to the SIG, and I'm assuming Aaron, you're on that.
Yep.
So.
Great. Thanks. Any questions, of course, feel free to ask, but thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion. All right, moving on. Let's take a look here. What's next on the agenda?
I think it's just my question, and this only needs to take 1 minute.
Sure.
So some guys on my team were asking about CSI backwards compatibility. Like it says that the CSI 1.1 sidecars require Kubernetes 1.14. So as a storage vendor, if you want to have a CSI plugin that also supports Kubernetes 1.13, what are you supposed to do?
That's a really good question. It's a terminology thing as well. Michelle, do you want to address this?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to work on like a official versioning and deprecation policy for our sidecars. But the main idea is that if the reason why the 1.1 sidecars require 1.14 is because we added support for the new 1.14 beta features. Now, in terms of backwards compatibility, if you don't use those new features, we will retain backwards compatibility with the existing sidecar command line flags and features. So if you only used 1.13 beta or GA features, you can still use the 1.1 sidecars with it. But if you needed to use any of the new 1.14 features, then you'll have to upgrade your cluster.
So
I think
the intent is you should be able to have one version of your plugin and one set of sidecars that supports a broad range of Kubernetes versions. Because what we don't want to have is a situation where you need a different CSI plugin for every Kubernetes version.
Right. So that is the intention. The problem is that there are new functionality that's being introduced with every new Kubernetes version. And we're trying to find a way to be able to express that and say, hey, if you're going to be using this version of the sidecar and you're expecting volume resizing to work, you're going to have to use at least Kubernetes 1.14. Volume resizing doesn't exist before that for CSI. I think there's a better way we can share that information to say, this is something along the lines of this is the minimum version of Kubernetes we support or something like that.
Well, yeah, like the sidecar needs a way to detect the Kubernetes version and to disable some functionality if it's old, or even if the sidecar version is new.
I mean, it already does that. So if you don't use the functionality, it's not going to do anything. Only when you use it, it'll just fail out and say, oh, it doesn't exist.
I think Ben is asking for more than that, though. I think what Ben is asking for is the sidecar to be able to support all versions of Kubernetes, even as a feature goes from alpha to beta to GA. And
yeah, like I'm imagining like a year in the future after we've gone through a few more Kubernetes versions, we want to have one version of the plugin that's compatible all the way back to 1.13. I realize going past 1.13 is not possible because of the CSI wasn't GA then, but what we don't want to have is a situation where we need to have different versions of the plugin depending on your Kubernetes version. We want to just have one that just works.
So I think the idea is that the goal I want to have is that if you use any beta or GA features of these sidecars, and as long as the version of the sidecar is within the same major version, you can use that sidecar for all supported releases of Kubernetes. But the problem is that if you use alpha features, or you end up using, or some beta feature gets deprecated in Kubernetes, then there's no more guarantee that your sidecar may work.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a tricky, it's a little tricky because the sidecar not only has to deal with Kubernetes compatibility, but it also has to deal with CSI version compatibility at the same time. So it's, and we can't possibly test every single permutation of Kubernetes and all the features going through alpha, beta, and GA. So I think what I'm trying to write a document that kind of explicitly spells this out, but I think there's going to be a different notion of like what might technically work in terms of Kubernetes or compatibility and what we will officially maintain and support.
Okay. I mean, I
through our
imagine
testing.
As a vendor, we'll be testing all the versions that we care to support to be sure that everything actually works. But I don't want to have a situation where, you know, after a few more versions in the future, we realize, oh, there's something that's broken, and now we have to ship two different things depending on what version you have. We want to be able to, you know, through some combination of disabling and enabling features and locking down some common core that works across all the versions, just ship one thing.
Yeah, it would definitely be simpler if you can ship one thing. The problem is that, like, as we introduce new features in Kubernetes and we introduce the corresponding logic in the sidecar, that new logic in the sidecar may not be able to handle like older versions of Kubernetes where, well,
but I would hope that it could detect the Kubernetes version is old and self-disable. Just say, oh, I'm talking to an old Kubernetes version, I'm turning myself off, and then everything works great.
Yes, and I think it can do that.
That would be the ideal. Is the sidecar is smart enough to determine the Kubernetes version and disable what won't work, and then enable what will work. And then you can always use the latest sidecar and never get into trouble as long as you stay away from alpha stuff.
Yeah, I think that's going to be hard to test and enforce.
We'll
But
test it.
sure. But so for example, in 1.14 we moved topology to beta, and then in our external provisioner we have the topology feature. And what I did there was have it disabled by default, so that if you are upgrading your sidecar from a 1.13 cluster and you want to upgrade to the new one, your sidecar won't break. But the moment that you go and enable topology, that requires and assumes that your cluster is on 1.14. And it will check the version and it will throw an error.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to make it more auto, so you don't have to specifically assert it, but say, hey, I want it if it's there and I don't want it if it's not there.
I mean, we kind of like autoed it by saying you have to explicitly enable the flag to turn on the feature, but you can only turn on the feature if your cluster is also on 1.14.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to think of.
So like you can still use the same the sidecar image, but you shouldn't turn on the new features.
I guess an installer could inspect the version and decide what to turn on and what to turn off at install time. That would kind of work. I guess, yeah. The problem then is if the Kubernetes version changes after you've installed, how do you go back and update what's new and what's not? Okay. Something to think about. Thank you. I didn't mean to spend this much time on. I just wanted a quick answer, but that's.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and Michelle's been thinking about this for a while. I think she has a doc that she's putting together. Maybe during the CSI work group meeting, we could have a discussion about this.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. All right, thank you very much. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Otherwise, we'll call it. Going once, going twice. All right, sold. Have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Bye. Thanks.